For me, there's one type of murderer, one type of thief that's really at the bottom of the pile. They really are as low as you can get. And they're the type of people that bully, beat, murder, mistreat vulnerable people, be them old or young. And in this case, they're the exact type of people we're looking at. Disclaimers before we get into it. This is a true crime case. It involves real people. Them real people have real families. So overall, I do want you to comment and I do want you to share. Please do so with sensitivity. 59-year-old James Anthony Sootheran was a popular but complex man. He was known by his middle name, Anthony, and that's the name that the judge used, so it's the name that I'm going to use throughout this case. He'd suffered from episodes of poor mental health. He worked as an auctioneer clerk, and he got married in 1985, but his problems soon became very apparent to his new wife. 3 years later, in 1988, his daughter was born, but Anthony found himself unable to cope, so he left the farm in which they lived in. Now, I believe the initial separation were only supposed to be for 2 weeks, but it weren't long after that the marriage broke down and he moved out. Then if we fast forward 18 years to 2006, Lynda and Wayne Rickards had moved into the farm. That's High Havens Farm in South Newington, Oxfordshire, England. They was living there as paying tenants. Lynda was a social worker and her husband Wayne, who was American born, had been a US Air Force engineer. But in 2008, just 2 years after, the living arrangements within the farm changed again. Anthony and his mom moved back into the farm, but Lynda and Wayne still stayed there. The deal was that Lynda would be paid £47,000 a year to care for both Anthony and his mom, and in return, Lynda and Wayne would also be able to live at the house for free. You see, the Sootherans, Joy and Anthony, were a wealthy family. They owned properties in Oxfordshire and land in Yorkshire. But it was only another 4 years, in 2012, that Joy, who'd previously been diagnosed with dementia, passed away at the age of 92. At this point, the farmhouse was becoming ramshackled and neglected. But despite its poor state, there were 60 acres worth of land, there were other outbuildings and stuff, so the farm was still very valuable. So much so that at a later date, it sold for £1.8 million. Almost £1.9 million. The death of Joy left her son Anthony on his own in the farm with his living carer Lynda and her husband Wayne. And I suppose if this weren't a true crime channel, you'd be forgiven for thinking at least Joy died with some peace of mind, knowing that someone was going to be taken care of, there were plenty of money, and these carers had been there for a while, they could be trusted. But that weren't the truth. Unbeknown to Joy or Andrew, Lynda had actually been stealing money, and lots of it too. Despite living rent-free and being paid £47,000 a year, Lynda was taking full advantage of their trust. And it'd be a few more years before anyone noticed that she'd been taking up to £167,000 from Joy's accounts. In one purchase alone, in 2010, they spent £33,000 of Joy's money out of Joy's account on a Mitsubishi Shogun car. It's noted that in 2011, Joy Sootheran had £80,000 worth of savings, but by the summer of 2012, she only had about £5,000. And after Joy's death, the theft didn't stop. Lynda went on to take another £133,000 from Anthony's accounts. Now, let's just bear in mind for a second, those two big amounts were up to amounts. The actual amounts could have been half of that. I think the very least amount that had definitely been stolen was a total of £90,000, which is still a huge amount of money to steal off someone that's paying you £47,000 and letting you live in their house. Lynda had been using all this money that she'd been stealing to pay for 3 children to go to a private school, and then buying other luxuries as well. In the light of Joy's death, not only was Lynda stealing from Anthony's accounts, but she weren't even doing that much of a good job at caring for him. For the next 18 months, Anthony ate very little, to the extent that in his last 15 months of life, he lost a third of his body weight. That's 26 kilograms, or 4 stone. But he's thought the reason he weren't eating was due to a psychiatric disease. And up until February 2014, he was mobile, and he was able to get his own food, and he was able to look after himself to an extent, especially when it came to eating and stuff. But in February 2014, he had 2 falls while at home. Those falls were on the 22nd and 23rd of February. And Lynda did call 111, which is the non-emergency National Health Service number.
Good afternoon, NHS 111. Can I start by taking the patient's location, starting with the postcode?
Okay, I'm not sure if it's an emergency or not. If I phone the right number.
I'm not sure. What are you looking for?
Okay, well, I have a friend living with me. He's in his late 50s.
Yep.
He's, I guess you call him a recluse. He doesn't go out very much, and his eating's not very good and things. Well, he had a bath last night, and he'd fell out of bed yesterday morning because his balance is not great, and he said his leg was hurting a bit. So, okay, he had a bath last night, thought maybe that would make him feel better. He said his leg was still hurting. I said, well, shall I run you up to the hospital to get an x-ray? No, it'll be fine. So this morning, I'd just gone to wake him up, and he fell out of bed again. He got back up on the bed, and he said, I can't put any weight on my left leg. Can't put any weight on my left leg.
Hurt yesterday as well?
Yeah. And he did stand on it last night, but he said it was hurting. Well, this morning he said it hurts. I just said to him, let's run up to the hospital to get you an x-ray, see if you've broken something or, whatever. He didn't want to do that. He doesn't want me to call the doctor this morning. So I just said, look, let me call the out of hours and see what to do. I don't know if it's broken or not, or if he's just pulled something or...
Yeah, if it's just really sort of heavy bruising.
Yeah, but I can't get him to come downstairs.
Right, okay. So he's not a very outgoing chap.
He doesn't go out very much at all.
So has he had any bleeding of any kind in the last half?
No.
He is breathing unconscious at the moment.
Sorry?
He is breathing unconscious.
Is he breathing?
Yes.
Yeah, he's breathing, sorry.
Yeah. That's the one. Right. Does he seem to have any breathing difficulties at all?
No. He sometimes has panic attacks and he hyperventilates a bit, but he's not even doing that at the moment.
And are you able to be in the same room as him, or would he not be happy about that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he'd be happy with that. You could just ask him when you get up there, just to pop his hand on the skin of his chest and see if it feels normal.
It does.
It does. Okay,
yeah, I've already checked that.
Okay. So which part of the leg's mainly affected, or is it...
He says it's the top of his leg that hurts.
Sort of thigh area?
Yeah.
Has he got any pain in his lower back?
No.
No. Any pain or swelling in his groin?
I don't know. I haven't checked.
Okay.
He doesn't. It's not hurting in there. But I don't know if there's any swelling.
Okay. So he obviously did he hit the legs on the way down?
I don't know. I mean, he's always falling out of bed. His balance goes sometimes. He has Labry NCI, his ear thing, where you balance.
Oh yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah.
And his balance goes and he gets a bit wobbly. So if he's walking along with him and suddenly he'll be sat on the floor. Doesn't happen a lot, but it happens sometimes when he gets up in the morning. If he gets up quick, he gets the wobbles. And I know he hit the floor yesterday morning, and he was okay after that. And it was last night. He said his leg was really hurting at the top, but he was still putting weight on his foot.
But he's struggling to.
Yeah.
Okay. Has his leg become cold, pale, or blue?
No.
Is the leg a different shape from normal?
No.
No. Does the leg look shorter than the one on the other side?
No.
Is he able to walk 4 steps?
I don't know this morning because he says it's hurting and I can't get him to...
Okay.
I've got him up, he landed on the floor, we've got him back up on the bed.
So, can you see if he can wait there just about, or if it's...
Right, he says he can't, he won't even try.
He won't try?
No. What shall I do?
So he won't, as in because of the pain, or he just will flat out refuse to leave?
If I can't because of the pain. Until I haven't tried yet, because he says it was hurting.
So he should, yes, his balance.
I'll try and get him to come down the stairs and get him in there, yeah?
If you can obviously get either side of him, I suppose you could go down on one leg,
yeah.
Just sort of hop down, as long as you go slowly.
Okay.
Because I was going to say, he couldn't do it on his own because of his balance issues,
yeah.
Didn't he? So if one of you, because obviously your husband's there as well, if you get either side of him, he should be okay to get down the stairs.
Okay.
But if obviously you have any other concerns, as in the sense that he doesn't want, he's flat out refusing to go,
yeah.
Bring us back, because the job will still be open, because all emergency department jobs stay open. So whoever you speak to, say that you've been told to go to the emergency department,
yeah.
The person that's supposed to be going is flat out refusing to leave.
Yeah. Okay.
And then obviously they'll be able to find the job and sort of look into it a bit further and see what they can do.
If everything went right with this video, You should have just heard the phone call. Lynda describes Anthony as her friend. She said he had a fall and is refusing to get medical help, or is unwilling to get medical help. The call handler says, look, you need to take him to accident and emergency at the hospital within the next 4 hours. But Lynda didn't. And if she had taken him to the hospital or to get any medical attention, he would have been treated with malnutrition. And maybe that's exactly why Lynda didn't take him. It's deemed that because of these falls, Anthony would have been left unable to walk. It had then quickly become immobile and bedbound. The estimated time frame for that would have been the 4th of March. Lynda also continued to ignore a developing life-threatening pressure sore which left him lying in severe pain on a soiled mattress next to a tarpaulin to protect the carpet. It was only a few weeks later, on the 18th of March 2014, that a doctor attended High Evans Farm and found Anthony dead. He was laying naked from the waist down on a mattress on the floor with a stained duvet over him. The thing is, by the doctor's own account, they had absolutely no reason to show up that day. It was just a general checkup after Lynda had made a call a few weeks prior. The doctor was a general practitioner who hadn't seen Anthony in almost a year because another doctor had been dealing with him. When she last visited a year ago, that too was for a general checkup, and she made a note of his appalling living conditions. The room was filthy. There were beard and nail trimmings on the floor, evidence of vermin, dirty bed linen. Anthony was dishevelled and wearing dirty clothing. I encouraged him to eat and drink and get more fresh air. I was worried about his lack of muscle mass and poor diet. As I said, shortly before this visit, Lynda had phoned the doctors, and she'd phoned because she was concerned about Anthony's eating habits. I got a message to call Lynda Rickard about Anthony. As far as I can recall, she had been worried about his eating over a previous couple of weeks. I prescribed him high-calorie drinks to try and get some calories into him. She seemed happy, but there was no particular urgency. I said I would be there within the next couple of days. I had not seen him for the past 12 months. He had been dealing with my colleague. I don't know why I visited that day. Probably because I had time. But when she got to the farm, the gates were locked. So she waited about for a short while, and Lynda returned. When I got there was nothing out of ordinary at the time. Lynda told me she had not seen Anthony since the previous morning, as she'd been clipping the horses. Lynda knocked very loudly and called, "Anthony! Anthony! The doctor is here to see you!" It was unusual and surprised me. When the door opened, the first thing that struck me was that the room was tidy. That was really unusual. There were some clean clothes which struck me as odd. The last time I went there, the floor was covered. My eyes went down to the floor where I saw Anthony. He was clearly dead. He was stone cold. I think I touched his head and checked for a pulse. He was cold and stiff. In the past, when I had visited, there had been mouse droppings in his bedroom, and I remember thinking, I hope there's no mouse under that covering on his body. I had not seen him for almost a year, and he was grossly thin. My concern in June 2013 was loss of muscle mass and looking thinner. He was grossly thinner on this occasion. I told Lynda Rickard that he was clearly dead, and we needed to remove ourselves from the room. She said, "Oh, Anthony," fairly loudly. Lynda and the doctor then went to the kitchen and waited for the police to arrive. And this is what the police said about when they arrived. I remember it being really cold in that room. There was a bucket of urine, and the room smelled like urine. I can't remember if there was a crack in the window, or the windows were open, but I can remember even now that it felt physically cold in that room. In Anthony's room, there was a drink, which is deemed to have been out of reach for him, and there was also a plate of food that had been untouched. Apparently, the food consisted of a plate of chocolate bars, a donut, a bag of McDonald's, toast, and an apple, which all seems a bit mumbo-jumbo, random. It seems like there's a lottery, and it all seems very random, so it could be media nonsense. Regardless, there were some food there, and somebody that went in, I don't know if it was the doctor or the police, said that the food looked fresher than Anthony, suggesting that the food had been placed there after Anthony had died. And I mean, this is quite a simple murder plan. Everybody knows Anthony's issues. They knew he weren't eating. So Lynda tried to get him to eat, but he wouldn't. She tried to get him medical help when he fell over, but he refused it. In her eyes, Anthony's demise was a consequence of how he chose to live his life. She'd done everything she could to help him, and she was devastated by his death. Poor old Lynda, you know. She's lost 2 very wealthy patients within the space of a year. It must have been super hard for her. Let's just hope that she's part of this multi-million-pound will. Before we get to the will though, you might be wondering where Anthony's daughter is during all this. And for all intents and purposes, she'd been deprived of contact with her dad. She did often try and visit him, but her visits were often cancelled by Lynda on suspicious pretexts. Nobody ever answered the phone when she called, and she was denied the code to the gate of the farm, so she couldn't get in. And his daughter kind of went, look, I find it really hard to contact you, and she gave him some phones. Notice the S there. She gave him more than one, but each of his phones unaccountably broke, or the settings within the phone were changed to block incoming calls, without explanation. The last time his daughter tried to visit him was in December 2013, just 3 months before his death. She went round to give him a Christmas present. She'd bought him a belt for his trousers, because he'd been using twine to hold his trousers up. Bearing in mind this was before his fall, so he's still mobile and stuff. However, she was told that her dad wanted to be left alone by Lynda, and this was really upsetting for her, and she left very tearful. But as she's driving away with her stepdad, she gets a phone call. I think she was like nearly at home, and it was her dad. And he's like, where are you? I do want to see you. Now, okay, I can see why this looks so obvious that there's something wrong. But I mean, we're looking at it from a true crime perspective. She's upset, and let's face it, they've always had issues. He's always had issues up in his head. Their relationship's always been very difficult from the very moment you were born, by all accounts. So ultimately, she's confused, and she just replies, I'm too upset now. This is too much. I can't deal with this. Unfortunately, she'd never see her dad again. So let's go back to poor Lynda, whose client / employer / landlord has died. But it turns out she didn't need to worry all that much. She didn't need a job, because she was about to be really rich. Anthony's will documents mention that Lynda and Anthony had a special friendship. The will gave Lynda Rickard a third of Anthony's estate, and at that time the estate's apparently worth something like £3.5 million. The will gave Lynda and Wayne's daughter a flat and their son a car for all the times he helped me to get in and out of it. And to be honest, when I look at the contents of the will, I think there's nothing that's suspicious on its own right. People do give the carers stuff in the will, it's not unknown, and let's face it, Anthony's died from starvation of his own cause, so everything is just as is, and it's all well, it's all good. And that is exactly what occurred. Anthony's death would treat us not suspicious. For Lynda, everything was going really well. All they had to do now was wait for everything to be processed, and it'd all be over. But there were two things that really screwed this up for Lynda. First of all, Anthony's daughter were like, no, there's something seriously wrong with this will. I don't trust its authenticity at all. And I don't mean she just stropped and moaned like a lot of relatives do in times like this. She weren't being bitter. She genuinely just didn't believe the will. So she went to civil court. She took them to civil court over the will, and she was just trying to get what was rightfully hers. Now let's not forget, in this will, the Rickards have been left a car, a flat, and the farm. They're getting well over £1 million out of this will. And the legal battle wasn't easy. It was time consuming, and it cost Anthony's daughter about £100,000 in fees. But Anthony's daughter, who was an accountant, actually won the case and got probate of her dad's estate. Now, I don't know the ins and outs of this part, but I'm fairly sure something like that would then prompt a criminal investigation on the grounds of fraud. When his daughter eventually got probate, the Rickards even went to the court in a failed attempt to uphold the will which they'd fraudulently signed. And the Rickards had lived on the farm way after Anthony's death. 3 years on, in 2017, was when they finally got evicted. And I assume, but I don't know, I assume this is when Anthony's daughter finally got probate over the estate and said, you need to get out now. The second thing that really went wrong for Lynda was that somebody noticed that after Anthony's death, someone was still taking money out of his account. Not only was someone taking money out of Anthony's bank account, but someone was also fraudulently claiming benefits in his name. Now, I'm not an expert on this, but based on my experience with relatives dying, when someone dies, everything is stopped, it's locked, it's shut down, you cannot access that money, you can't put money in, you can't take money out, and it basically goes to a department where they go, right, this is owed by whatever. But the point being is, I don't understand how they were taking money out of his account after he died. Like I said, I'm not an expert, it's just something I thought of and thought, how did that work? Either which way, this is two different types of attention that you really don't need when you're about to inherit £1 million. And if it weren't for these kinds of attention, then everything would have gone through. Nobody would have been any the wiser. Then in 2019, 5 years after Anthony's death, 60-year-old Lynda Rickard, who was living 8 miles away from the farm at Edinburgh Close, was arrested.
Yeah. I've got quite a lot to read out to you, alright? So I'll read it all out and try and hopefully explain.
Am I being arrested and being taken away?
You are going to be, yeah. Alright.
Just listen to what my colleague's going to say.
I'm not really interested.
Okay. Alright, so the time now, Lynda, is 05:34. Okay. I'm arresting you on suspicion of murder. Okay. Contrary to common law, that you unlawfully killed James Anthony Sootheran at Powellhaven's farm in 2014.
Well, it's
okay?
murder now, is it?
I'm further arresting you as well for fraud by false representation, contrary to Section 1 and 2 of the Fraud Act 2006, that you've been identified as withdrawing significant cash from bank accounts and use of bank cards in the name of James Anthony Sootheran between 2012 and 2014. It's suspected that these withdrawals were made by Lynda without permission. Further arrest for making a false instrument of intent which be accepted as genuine under the Forgery and Counterfeiting Act 1981. It's suspected that Lynda Rickard made false instruments in respect of the purported wills of Mary, Joy Sootheran and James Anthony Sootheran.
Just give us a minute. 1 minute, please.
And a number of purported tenancy agreements. Furthermore, it's suspected that signatures were forged on banking documents relating solely to James Anthony Sootheran. Okay. I'm also arresting you for fraud by false representation, again, contrary to Section 1 and 2 of the Fraud Act 2006, and theft, contrary to Section 1, Subsection 1 and 7 of the Theft Act 1968. Investigation has identified that Mitsubishi Shogun Index Whiskey Victor 10 November Whiskey Papa was purchased in August 2010. Payment was made by cheque bearing the signature of Joy Sootheran. It's suspected that this signature was forged. The vehicle was sold on the 13th of August 2014 and the funds were not credited to the estate of Mary Joy Sootheran.
Please don't talk to each other just now.
Just say no comment to anything.
Let's not.
They're on the table. Yeah, that's fine. You can grab them.
Wayne, just say no comment.
That video's not awfully clear, so let's go through the charges again. Lynda Rickard has been arrested on 1 count of murder, 1 count of manslaughter, 4 counts of fraud by false representation, 1 count of fraud by abuse of position, 2 counts of making a false instrument with intent to be accepted as genuine, 2 counts of conspiring to prevent the course of justice, and 1 count of possess/control article for the use of fraud. Her husband Wayne Rickard, who was 64, was charged with 1 count of murder, 1 count of causing or allowing death to a vulnerable person, 1 count of fraud by false representation, and 1 count of conspiring to pervert the course of justice. And that's a lot of counts just for 2 people. So now we know that it's not poor old Lynda, and it's more like evil vulture Lynda. Let's go back and fill in the blanks. It was in 2006 that Lynda started being paid £47,000 a year with the benefit of not paying rent to look after Joy and her son. Lynda took full advantage of the fact that Joy had dementia. Not only did she steal tens of thousands of pounds from her, she also forged a will after her death, gifting herself £750,000 in cash and in properties. 4 years on, in 2010, Wayne, Lynda's husband, stopped working. It was another 2 years after that Joy passed away. She's then just caring for Anthony, and he too is vulnerable. It's thought that he had OCD and clinical depression, and as a result of that, he was reclusive. And that alone, forgetting everything else that comes with those, the fact that he was reclusive made him incredibly vulnerable. It was that made it so easy for Lynda to prey on him, prey on his insecurities, isolate him even more, and then make him completely dependent on her. And she did an excellent job at doing just that. As we've heard, she drove a wedge right between him and his daughter, leaving him with absolutely nobody else in Lynda's way. During this entire ordeal, she bled his mom dry of money, and now she's bleeding him dry of money. But a problem arose. There was talk of Anthony moving out of the farm and into a cottage closer to his daughter, so they could see each other more often. I mean, just imagine how detrimental that would have been for Lynda's current lifestyle. The control over Anthony's life would have been gone. But even more worryingly for Lynda, the control over his bank accounts would also be gone. It might have even resulted in the farm being sold from underneath her, leaving her homeless. So Lynda felt that a high-flying lifestyle that was really easy needed more security. And you might think, well, why weren't £700,000 from Joy's will enough? And of course, yeah, she was greedy. But actually, that will were also being challenged in court at that time. So there was a new plan. She would forge a will in Anthony's name and then kill him to try and make good on that one. But of course, she needed witnesses for the signing of the forged wills. That wasn't and never had been an issue, and she just persuaded friends or acquaintances to sign as witnesses. Don't worry, they shared the court with Lynda and they were sentenced with her. But we'll get to them later. With all the documentation forged and in the right place, Lynda set her plan into motion. She didn't have to do much. In fact, she didn't have to do anything at all. As long as nobody came round to the farm, there was no way for Anthony to ask for help. And as far as anybody knew, it was his fault for refusing to eat or get help. Again, it were a perfect murder. She could say that she tried her best, but he refused and she's heartbroken, as she did. It was the geriatrician that said Anthony wouldn't have been able to walk from when he fell over on the 23rd of February and would have been immobile from the 4th of March. They said as a result, Anthony formed a large bed sore which would have broken through the skin on or about the 4th of March. And from that time, it would have emitted a foul smell. It would have caused Anthony that much pain that if he had been admitted to hospital, he would have been given morphine. In his last days, Anthony would have been unable to swallow or ingest food, or to pick anything up within his reach. And towards the end of his life, he would have been hot, sweaty, and confused. Things would have got even worse for Anthony though. In the days before his death, he would have lost the capacity to make rational decisions. He would have been incontinent, unable to reach a bathroom or even a commode. And it was deemed that Anthony had not eaten for the last 34 hours of his life. It was the combination of malnutrition and the deep-seated pressure sore on Anthony's back that led to a fatal lung infection / pneumonia. And the sore would have been obvious. And if he had been admitted to hospital at any time before he died, there would have been a very good chance of his survival. And in court, the judge asked whether it was conceivable that Lynda was unaware that Anthony was seriously ill. And this doctor said, "He must have been cleaned up. You'll see what's going on." The judge told Lynda, "You must have watched him die in this way," referring to the fact that Anthony can't have just been left on his own for a week or two. Somebody, namely Lynda, must have gone into his room and cleaned away his excrement from the floor, if nothing else. He also made it clear that Lynda could have ended his suffering at any time by either feeding him or getting him medical help. It was considered to be a fact that after Anthony had died, Lynda had tidied his room up, put clean clothes out, and put food close to his body to make it look like they had been looking after him. And as I mentioned before, after he died, Lynda then continued taking money from his accounts, waited for the fraudulent will proceeds, and for almost 2 years continued to claim benefits from a forged document in Anthony's name. At the time of her arrest, Lynda had also been found with a number of forged tenancy agreements in Anthony's name, which she intended to use to commit further fraud, but she got arrested before she had the chance to do so. And as if this case and trial wasn't long and complicated enough, but it actually went to court twice, because on Tuesday the 28th of January 2020, the jury was discharged for legal reasons and a retrial was set. According to an ITV news article, to bring this case to court, the Crown Prosecution Service reviewed more than 20,000 pages of evidence, submitted detailed medical, financial and handwriting evidence, and relied on the accounts of several hundred witnesses. It was on the 28th of May 2021 that the jury at Reading Crown Court found Lynda Rickard guilty of the murder of Anthony Sootheran. They also found her guilty of fraud by obtaining a car using Joy's bank account without her permission. And there were more charges. Lynda had already pled guilty to 3 counts of fraud involving the proper use of Anthony's bank account while he was still alive. 1 count of fraud involving the improper use of his mom's accounts. 2 counts of forgery involving both wills. 1 count of possessing forged documents with the intent of committing fraud. 2 counts relating to the attempts to pervert the course of justice by trying to persuade a court that the wills were genuine. And 1 count of obtaining benefits by deception. It was 4 days later, on the 4th of June 2021, that she was sentenced. Because she'd been found guilty of murder, the only sentence that was applicable was that of life. And it was clearly a murder for gain, so the minimum starting point was 30 years. The aggravating factors were the huge amount of planning and premeditation. Anthony were vulnerable. The suffering and pain Anthony must have endured mentally and physically. 2 specific counts of theft were added as aggravating factors. The fact that Lynda had persuaded people to submit false witness statements claiming the wills to be genuine, drawing people in to signature witness the wills. The other forged documents were also an aggravating factor, and the benefit fraud with the forged documents. For Lynda's mitigating factors, she had no previous convictions, which wasn't a strong factor due to the long list of convictions that she now had. Her age at the time of the sentencing, which was 62 years old, and a lack of good health at the time of sentencing. The judge then said the minimum term would be increased to 33 years. However, due to her age, it would then decreased to 28 years. Which, when I read that bit, I kind of thought, that's not fair. Why should she have 5 years took off just because she's getting old? She's not even that old. She's 68. It's not like she's an old biddy. Then I thought, well, actually, she's 62, 28, she's going to be 90. I don't think she's going to live till she's 90, so whatever, 28 will do. And for the sake of information, let's tirelessly go through all the other convictions that Lynda was given. For fraudulent use of Joy and Anthony's bank accounts, which is 4 counts by the way, she got 4 years and 6 months on each count, but to run concurrent to each other. Forging of the 2 wills, which again, that's 2 counts to run concurrent to each other. The attempts to pervert the course of justice in relation to both wills, again, multiple counts, that's 18 months each to run concurrent to each other. Possession of other forged documents, that's 3 years, and the benefit fraud, that's 12 months. That is a massive web of concurrent and consecutive, but cancelling out all the concurrents, together those totaled 11 years, which is to run concurrent to a 28 years minimum life sentence. So, like I said, it's completely pointless, but it's information, it's there, it's what she got. And I find it interesting that they even bother. You know, you really had may as well just go, yeah, they don't matter because she did something worse. But as I've said, Lynda didn't act entirely alone, nor was she alone in the dock. In fact, it was quite a crowded place, that dock. Her husband, Wayne Rickard, was not found guilty of assisting Lynda in murder. However, he was found guilty of allowing the death of a vulnerable adult. It was the prosecution's case that Wayne was living in the same house. He was the only person that could have stepped in and saved Anthony. It was put forward that Wayne had to have noticed that there were never any food taken from the kitchen to Anthony, and that although he didn't see Anthony on a daily basis, he did see him often enough to know that he was no longer about. Further on from that, the bedrooms were quite close to each other, so he should have either smelt his sores, because that's how bad these things apparently smell, or at least heard him shouting in pain, heard his discomfort. Wayne was also found guilty of fraud in relation to the Shogun car, and he was also found guilty of attempting to pervert the course of justice by making a false statement in the High Court. Wayne's mitigating factors were his previous good character. He didn't have any previous convictions and he'd been a hard worker up until 2010. He too was also not in good health at the time of the sentencing. And interestingly, there isn't any sentencing guidelines for allowing the death of a vulnerable adult. So the judge had to use the guidelines for sentencing allowing the death of an infant, pointing out that just like a child, Anthony had become dependent on Lynda and of Wayne. So for allowing death, Wayne received 8 years. For the fraud, he got 21 months to run consecutively, and another 9 months for perverting the course of justice, again to run consecutively. totaling 10.5 years, but Wayne will serve only half of that before he's allowed to be released on licence. But wait, there is more to come. After they'd been given their sentences, they were taken out of the court. The judge then turned to 51-year-old Shanda Robinson and 78-year-old June Alsford. They were both signature witnesses for Joy's fraudulent will. Bearing in mind, at the time that this will was signed, Joy was already dead. And because Lynda was set to gain over £500,000, that's the threshold, the charges were more serious. However, the judge accepted that for these two, they weren't motivated by personal gain. They weren't going to gain anything out of it. There were no incentives. They weren't doing it for themselves or anything like that. So the starting point for their sentences were 3 years imprisonment. The only aggravating factor was the victim's vulnerability. Shanda's mitigation was her previous good character, references from her husband and her mom. She also had a good work record for Royal Mail, and at the time of sentencing, she had a 14-year-old child. She was the mother of a 14-year-old. However you want to word that, same difference. So, for the fraud, Shanda received 24 months. And for conspiracy to pervert the course of justice, she received 8 months consecutive, totaling 32 months in prison. The conspiracy to pervert there is because they both went to the High Court and said, no, it's genuine. And like Wayne, Shanda would only serve half of her sentence before she's released on licence. June, on the other hand, were actually completely different. She just outright pled guilty, unlike everybody else. But not only did she step away from the peer pressure and just plead guilty, she also tried to get Shanda to do the same thing. And June even cooperated with the police. She was just going, look, I'm sorry, I've done something wrong, I really am sorry, shouldn't have done it, I wish I hadn't done it, I'm really sorry. And let's not forget, at this time June is 78 years old. This trial had gone on for a really long time, and she had really good references, character references, but that didn't actually make a difference. She did get the same amount of time as Shanda, 32 months. However, there is a big difference. She actually pled guilty, which gave her a 25% discount, which made her sentence 24 months. Now, 24 months is a really significant number, because 2 years is the benchmark as to whether a sentence can be suspended or not. Had her sentence been a single day longer, she wouldn't have been able to receive a suspended sentence. And the judge saw that June was someone that was very unlikely to commit this offence again, or any other offence. And with the other things that I've just mentioned, the judge did suspend June's sentence for 2 years. Meaning, she's free to leave, but if she commits any other crimes in those 2 years, she will be doing time in prison. Are you still with me so far? There's only 2 more people left in the dock, so let's get them sentenced. We've got 41-year-old Denise Neal and 49-year-old Michael Dunkley. They both signed as witnesses on Anthony's will, while Anthony was still alive. Unlike everybody else in this case, what sets Denise and Michael apart is that they didn't go on to make a false statement in the High Court. However, Denise, also unlike everybody else, received a payment via cheque from Anthony's bank account at about the time that they was a witness signature. So obviously the prosecution's gone, that's a payment for being a witness. Especially as it's deemed that at the time Anthony wasn't fit enough to sign a cheque. He weren't even strong enough to hold a pen. But Denise were like, no, you've got that totally wrong. That was a payment for helping look after Joy while she was alive. And obviously the prosecution says, okay, so why did Anthony pay you 18 months after she died? And she also claimed that it was for a birthday, but she never went round to see to thank Anthony, because obviously then she'd have seen that he was dying. Because she'd been paid to fraudulently be a witness, personal gain was a massive aggravating factor. But she did also have mitigating circumstances. Before signing the will, Denise was of previous good character, and just before signing the will, she'd found out that her mom had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. Denise had a good working record, and she did look after Joy without payment during her life. Oh, and finally, last mitigating factor for Denise, she had a daughter who would suffer if she were in prison. Michael was also said to be of a good previous character, and he hadn't been found to receive money for signing the will. So Denise received 27 years for fraud, which is too long to be suspended. Michael received 24 months for fraud, which isn't too long to be suspended, but the judge said, nope, not suspending it. just because you haven't shown any remorse and there's not enough mitigating factors for me to justify suspending your sentence. Again, both Denise and Michael will only serve half of their sentences before being released on licence. But wait, we're not finished yet, because there was an appeal. It was Wayne, Lynda's husband, that appealed his sentence. And to be fair, I haven't looked into it all that much because it got refused anyway. But yeah, he appealed it and they've said no, it was right, get yourself back to prison. And I have got an interesting fact for you. According to the senior Crown prosecutor, this is a landmark case. This is the first time in 100 years that the Crown Prosecution Service has authorised an offence of murder by deliberate starvation. I just thought that was really interesting, so I want to push it in there. And the very, very last thing I've got for you is a tribute that was released by Thames Valley Police on their Facebook page. Joy loved the village of Bloxham, a true lady. Before her retirement, she was a well-respected matron at Bloxham School. She loved her dogs, her garden, and her life. We can't understand how someone who said they cared deeply for Joy could steal tens of thousands of pounds from her when she was suffering with dementia and in such a vulnerable state. Anthony was very intelligent and a popular person. He loved the rural life, livestock markets, farm sales, and general auctions. He had an attitude that everything had value. Unfortunately, as life went by, he suffered from mental health issues, which the Rickards took full advantage of, preventing him from receiving much needed help from his family, friends, and qualified professionals. There was a glimmer of hope for him when he had conversations about moving out and living closer to Hannah, a daughter he adored. But this was never going to be the case, living under the same roof as Lynda and Wayne Rickard. Anthony was only 59-year-old when he died, which is no age at all. We can't comprehend how somebody who said they cared deeply for Anthony let him die in such horrible conditions. The negative impact this had on our lives, and especially that of Anthony's daughter Hannah, has been heartbreaking. We have not had the chance to grieve and be able to get on with a normal life. Our trust in people has deteriorated significantly, and we have had to heavily rely on each other to help us get through this, to be able to process what's happened. During this trial, we are still no further forward of being given answers from either of the Rickards on why they did this to Joy and Anthony. Our final visit to Anthony, which was prevented by Lynda Rickard's, will stay with us forever. There you go, that's all I've got for you. I know this case is in a very different format. I know I got it twice from two different perspectives, but it was a really hard case to write because there's so much different information. There's bits of information that's really hard to come by that ties it all together. So I hope you like the way I've formatted it. Truth be told, I format all the cases slightly different depending on how I find the information and depending what the information is. So there you go. Let me know what you thought about it anyway down below. Let me know your thoughts on the entire thing. It is an absolutely awful case, and to just leave somebody to die, it does remind me a little bit of the Scottish House of Horrors we did, where her sister and her daughter left her to die in a bedroom. Although I will say that obviously in that case the daughter was found as innocent, so her sister left her. But what an absolutely awful case. My heart goes out to everybody who knew Anthony and Joy, obviously. And I suppose the only thing I've got to say is, again, easier in hindsight, but if you know something's wrong, don't do it. Don't back down to peer pressure. When you're signing something, this is a big one, when you're signing something, no matter how much of a rush you're in, read it or don't sign it. Simple. And I do think in things like this, fraudulent wills and whatnot, you might get away with it for some time, but you will eventually get caught, especially if it's on such a high scale that this was. We're not talking a few quid, we're talking literally millions. I think if they'd have had the farm, which is now worth 2.6 million, I think I saw, 2.3 million. Even before that, in 2008, it sold for £1.8 million, £1.9 million. So then if you put the £500,000 on top, £750,000 on top of that she tried to take off Joy, that's £2 million. This really were fraud on a multi-million-pound basis. There you go. I'm tired now because it took me 2 hours to record this, and it'll probably only be half an hour's worth of footage, and I can hear next door hoovering. So I'm going to leave you to it. Don't forget, all I'm saying is, I love you. Take care of yourself, take care of those around you, and I'll see you next week. Bye.